Karoline left. It was supposed to be an easy target. But when the host lost control, the internet saw the truth for themselves. Karoline Leavitt had done plenty of interviews before. Some were civil, others combative. But none had ever made her hesitate, until now. The email arrived late in the evening. An exclusive invitation, at the Franklin Hour. One of the most watched political talk shows in the country. The host, Graham Franklin, was a seasoned media personality known for his sharp tongue and theatrical takedowns of conservative guests. Clips of his interviews often went viral, usually ending with his opponents fumbling for words while his audience roared with laughter. Karoline skimmed the details: primetime slot, live audience, millions watching from home. This was a major opportunity. But it was also a trap, and she knew it. Her team wasn't thrilled. "You know how this goes," her media advisor, Tom, warned. "Franklin doesn't do fair debates. He does hit jobs." "I'm not worried about Franklin," Karoline replied, setting her phone down. "I'm worried about whether people will actually listen." She had built her career on cutting through media bias, standing her ground where others crumbled. She wasn't about to back down now. But the truth was, Franklin had a reputation for turning words against his guests, twisting their responses into headline-worthy soundbites. This wasn't just an interview, it was an ambush disguised as a conversation. Still, she accepted. The days leading up to the interview were spent preparing for every possible attack. Her team ran mock debates, drilling her on Franklin's most infamous tactics: loaded questions, sarcastic jabs, interruptions designed to throw guests off balance. She rehearsed counterarguments, memoized statistics, and sharpened her delivery. But as the night of the interview arrived, she knew no amount of preparation could fully predict what was coming. The studio was in Los Angeles, a sleek, modern space with massive LED screens and blinding lights. The moment she stepped into the green room, the tension was palpable. Staff members moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones. Producers exchanged glances as she walked by. She could feel it. They expected a spectacle. A junior producer, barely looking up from his clipboard, handed her a MIC pack. "You'll be up in 5. Franklin's wrapping up his monologue. Karoline took a deep breath. The air felt heavier than usual, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had been in tough rooms before. This was just another one. A stagehand waved her forward. The applause was already starting. The audience was hyped up, ready for what they thought would be an easy takedown. Franklin stood in the center of the stage, smirking as she approached. "Welcome, Karoline," he said, extending a hand. "Brave of you to come here." It was the first jab, disguised as a compliment. She shook his hand and took her seat, her expression unreadable. She could already tell how this was going to go. But Franklin was in for a surprise, because she wasn't here to play defense. She was here to flip the script. The second Karoline sat down, she felt the energy in the room shift. The audience wasn't just watching, they were waiting. Waiting for the moment Franklin would sink his claws in, spin his narrative, and leave her scrambling to keep up. Graham Franklin adjusted his tie and leaned back in his chair, exuding the kind of smug confidence that only came from years of absolute control in his domain. "Karoline Leavitt," he began, his voice smooth but dripping with sarcasm. Conservative firebrand. Self-proclaimed truth-teller. Quite the reputation. Karoline gave a polite nod, unfazed. "I appreciate the invitation." Franklin chuckled. "Of course. We always welcome different perspectives." He glanced at the audience, flashing his signature smirk. "Even the ones that come from inside an echo chamber." The audience laughed, some a little too eagerly. Karoline kept her expression neutral. She had expected this. "It's funny," Franklin continued, flipping through his notes. "You talk a lot about media bias, about how conservative voices are silenced. Yet here you are, sitting across from me on one of the biggest platforms in the country. How exactly does that fit into your silenced narrative? The audience clapped. Franklin grinned, knowing he had already planted the first seed of doubt. Karoline folded her hands on the desk. Being invited onto a show doesn't mean getting a fair conversation, she said, her tone even. It just means being served up as entertainment. Franklin raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. Is that what you think? This is a circus act? Karoline didn't blink. It's a pattern. You bring on conservatives, cut them off, reframe their words, and by the time they leave, the only thing people remember is your monologue, because they never actually got to hear ours. For the first time, Franklin didn't have an immediate comeback. The audience murmured, a few shifting in their seats. So, you saying I'm unfair? Franklin finally asked. That I twist words? I don't have to say it, Karoline answered. Your clips speak for themselves. More murmurs filled the room. Franklin cleared his throat, straightening in his chair. His confidence wavered for just a second, but it was enough. Still, he wasn't going to let her control the narrative. He leaned forward, his expression shifting into something calculated. Let's talk about truth then, shall we? He said, flipping over a sheet of paper. Because I have some of your past statements here, and I'd love for you to clarify them. Karoline saw it coming, the setup. Franklin's favorite tactic. Bringing up quotes without context, forcing his guests to either defend something misleading or waste time correcting the record. She knew she had to be sharp. Go ahead, she said, meeting his gaze. Let's talk about truth. Franklin smiled, sensing his moment. He looked down at his notes. You once said, and I quote, the mainstream media would rather push propaganda than admit the facts. He set the paper down. Do you really believe that, Karoline? Or is that just something you say to rile people up? He leaned back, confident he had her cornered. But Karoline didn't flinch. I believe the facts speak for themselves, she said. So let me ask you, Ram, how many times has this network had to retract a story in the last 2 years? The audience went silent. Franklin's smirk flickered just for a moment. Karoline continued. How many times has the media run with a narrative before getting all the facts? And when that narrative turns out to be wrong, how often is the correction given the same airtime as the original story? A shift. The laughter that had come so easily earlier was gone. Franklin's jaw tensed slightly. He shuffled his papers, buying himself a second to regroup. Karoline could see it, the discomfort creeping in. He had expected a fight. He hadn't expected a mirror. Franklin recovered quickly, flashing a tight-lipped smile as he leaned forward, hands folded, like a teacher about to correct a misbehaving student. You know, Karoline, he said smoothly, that's a great deflection. But we're not here to talk about my network. We're here to talk about you and your claims. So let's stick to that, shall we? Karoline didn't miss a beat. I thought we were here to talk about the truth, she said. If the media claims to be objective but routinely shapes narratives to fit a specific agenda, isn't that relevant? Franklin let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. That's a clever way to dodge the question, he said, holding up a printed quote. Let's try this again. You once said, the government and media work together to suppress inconvenient truths. That sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory, doesn't it? There it was, the setup. The moment where he would attempt to paint her as a fringe extremist, someone too radical to be taken seriously. If she pushed back too hard, she'd be labeled paranoid. If she softened her stance, she'd be accused of backtracking. Karoline took a breath, steadying herself. It's not a conspiracy theory if it's documented fact, she said plainly. The government has pressured tech companies to censor certain information. There are emails proving it. Public records confirming it. If that's a conspiracy, it's one backed up by their own paper trail. The audience murmured. A few heads in the crowd turned, whispering to each other. Franklin's jaw clenched slightly before he plastered on another smirk. And yet, he said, tapping his fingers against the desk, the biggest media outlets in the country don't report it the way you do. Why do you think that is? Karoline tilted her head. Because they benefit from it. A noticeable shift in the room. The audience was no longer just listening, they were processing. Franklin's fingers tapped faster. Oh, so now the entire mainstream media is corrupt, he shot back, his voice rising slightly. Every single journalist is in on this grand scheme? Karoline gave him a small, almost amused smile. You're proving my point right now. Franklin blinked. Excuse me? She gestured around them. Look at how you're framing this, she said. I never said every journalist. But instead of addressing the facts, you're turning this into a caricature, like I'm some lunatic ranting about shadowy figures in a dark room. That's how you control the conversation, not with facts, but by making the person presenting them look ridiculous. Another murmur from the audience. Franklin glanced toward the producers. The energy in the room had shifted. He could feel it. He was losing control. But he wasn't done yet. Franklin inhaled sharply, then suddenly leaned back, spreading his arms. All right, Karoline, he said, adopting a more casual tone. Let's move on to something simpler. Something everyone can agree on. That was another tactic. When cornered, pivot. Reset the battlefield. Karoline braced herself. Franklin pulled out another sheet of paper. Let's talk about January 6th. The audience stirred. Karoline saw the trap instantly. It was always the go-to subject, the moment where any conservative guest was forced into a no-win situation. Either denounce their base or be accused of defending extremism. Franklin adjusted his glasses. You've been very critical of the media's coverage of the event, he said. So let's be crystal clear, do you believe it was an insurrection? Karoline met his gaze. I believe violence is wrong. I believe political violence is wrong, whether it happens in a federal building, outside a courthouse, or on city streets. Franklin's smirk returned. That's a nice rehearsed answer, but it's not what I asked. Karoline didn't budge. I answered the question. You just don't like the answer. The audience shifted again. Franklin exhaled, tapping his notes. His frustration was starting to show. The control he once had over the conversation was slipping through his fingers. And for the first time in a long time, the audience wasn't on his side. He could feel it. But instead of backing off, he decided to push harder. And that was his biggest mistake. Franklin's patience was wearing thin. He had thrown every trick in the book at her, sarcasm, misdirection, condescension. But Karoline wasn't budging. Worse, the audience wasn't reacting the way they usually did. This wasn't going his way. He needed something bigger. Franklin glanced down at his notes, then back up at Karoline, his expression shifting. All right, he said, voice lower now. Since we're talking about truth, let's talk about you. Karoline didn't flinch. Franklin leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the desk. You talk a lot about accountability, transparency, and honesty. But let's put that to the test, shall we? The studio was silent. Franklin flipped to a page in his folder. Karoline, you've worked in politics. You know how the game is played. You've defended people who have made inflammatory statements, people who have spread misinformation. And yet, here you sit, acting as if you're above it all. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Is there a question in there, or are we just throwing out accusations? Franklin's lips curled into a smirk. Fine. Let's make it direct. Have you ever misled your audience? There it was, the loaded question. A question designed not for an honest answer, but for a soundbite. Karoline knew exactly what was happening. If she hesitated even for a second, Franklin would seize it. If she answered no, he would accuse her of arrogance. If she said yes, he would use it as proof that she was a hypocrite. She inhaled slowly, then responded. I speak about what I believe to be true based on the information available at the time. If new facts emerge, I acknowledge them. That's called intellectual honesty, and it's something we could use a little more of in media today. Franklin's smirk faltered. That wasn't the response he wanted. The audience was locked in, watching him now, not her. He had to regain control. That's convenient, he shot back, flipping through his notes again. Because I have a few examples where your intellectual honesty seems a little selective. Karoline crossed her arms, waiting. Franklin cleared his throat. In 2021, you tweeted that the mainstream media refused to cover rising crime rates. But we pulled the data, and actually, multiple outlets had reported on it. Karoline didn't blink. Which outlets? And how much coverage did they give? Compared to, say, celebrity gossip or political drama? Franklin looked down at his notes, flipping through them. The moment dragged too long. And in that second, the audience felt it. He didn't have the numbers. Karoline smiled slightly. See, that's the problem, Graham. The media loves to say, oh, we covered it, but they never talk about how they covered it. Was it a passing mention? A buried article? A segment at 2 a.m. when nobody was watching? Franklin's face tensed. He opened his mouth, but Karoline wasn't finished. Because I can tell you how they covered other stories, ones that fit their narrative. Wall-to-wall coverage. Headline after headline. Panel discussions. Opinion pieces. Viral clips. So sure, maybe they technically covered crime. But did they prioritize it? Did they treat it as seriously as they should have? Or did they downplay it because it didn't fit the preferred message? The audience shifted. Franklin clenched his jaw, fingers tightening on his notes. He was losing control. That's when it happened. His frustration boiled over, and he snapped. Oh, give me a break, Karoline, he blurted out, his voice sharp. You act like some kind of victim when in reality, you're just another talking head, pushing propaganda like everyone else. The room froze. Even the audience, who had been so eager to laugh at his jabs earlier, was stunned into silence. It was the first time in years that Franklin had lost his composure on live television. Karoline leaned back in her chair, expression calm. She didn't have to say anything. He had just proven her point for her. Franklin knew it too. He exhaled sharply, adjusting his tie, trying to recover. But it was too late. Because the moment had already gone viral. The silence in the studio stretched uncomfortably. Franklin's outburst had landed like a brick through glass, barking, messy, and impossible to ignore. Karoline didn't need to respond, as she simply watched as Franklin tried to claw back control of the room. He adjusted his tie, shifted in his seat, forcing a grin that no longer looked confident. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The producers must have sensed the shift too because a sharp voice suddenly cut through Karoline's earpiece. We're going to commercial. Franklin barely nodded before the studio lights dimmed and the screen faded to black. The theme music played, but nobody was paying attention. As soon as the cameras were off, Franklin yanked off his earpiece and threw it onto the desk. What the hell was that? He muttered under his breath. Karoline remained seated, unshaken. That was you losing your temper. Franklin let out a short laugh, but it wasn't amused, it was frustrated. The producers were already scrambling around him. One whispered in his ear, another gestured toward the control room. Karoline caught snippets. Twitter is blowing up. We need to address it when we're back. Do we pivot? They were panicking. One of Franklin's assistants approached Karoline cautiously. "Miss Leavitt, would you like some water?" "No, I'm fine." She wasn't the one who needed cooling down. Meanwhile, Franklin rubbed a hand over his face, muttering something to his producer. Damage control, that's what this was. Karoline could already imagine the spin they were going to put on it. Maybe they'd edit the clips later, cutting out the parts that made him look bad. Maybe Franklin would crack a joke about it in the next segment, pretend the whole thing was just a little heated discussion. But what he didn't realize was that it was already too late. Even before the commercial break ended, the moment had exploded online. The clip was everywhere: Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. People were dissecting it in real time. Did Franklin just completely lose it on Karoline Leavitt? I've never seen him this rattled before. She got under his skin bad. This is exactly why people don't trust mainstream media. Look how fast he resorted to personal attacks. And then came the memes. Screenshots of Franklin's face mid-outburst. GIFs of Karoline's calm, almost amused expression. Some had captions like "when the debate doesn't go as planned" or "Franklin when he realizes he's not in control anymore." Even people who didn't usually agree with Karoline were weighing in. "I don't like her politics, but she handled that interview like a pro." Say what you want about her, but Franklin just made a fool of himself. Within an hour, the video had millions of views across platforms. By the time the show returned from commercial, the damage was done. Franklin forced a stiff smile as the cameras came back on. His voice was lighter, almost playful, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't just happened. "Well, that was a lively discussion," he said, letting out a chuckle. "Karoline, you certainly know how to keep things interesting." Karoline smiled back, but this time, she had nothing to prove. "I just believe in honest conversations, Graham." The audience clapped, not for him, but for her. And he knew it. The segment wrapped up quickly after that. Franklin didn't dare push further. He read off the teleprompter, thanked her for coming, shook her hand with a little too much force, and as soon as the show ended, he was gone. But Karoline's night wasn't over. As soon as she stepped out of the studio, her phone was flooded. Her team, journalists, supporters, even critics, everyone wanted a comment. News outlets were already writing headlines. "Graham Franklin loses his cool in fiery exchange with Karoline Leavitt." "Karoline Leavitt exposes Franklin's bias on live TV." "Talk show host has meltdown after guest pushes back." Some tried to frame it differently. "Karoline Leavitt sparks controversy with host." But the internet had already decided the narrative. Franklin wasn't the hard-hitting journalist challenging the system. He was the face of media arrogance, getting caught in real time. Karoline knew moments like this weren't just one-off TV clashes. They were part of something bigger, a growing frustration with how public discourse was being controlled, packaged, and manipulated. She didn't go on that show expecting to win anything. She went to be heard. And for once, the audience got to see what happened when someone refused to play the game. But the real question was, what would Franklin do next? Would he own his reaction, admit he was wrong? Or would he, like so many before him, double down and play the victim? Karoline had her guess. And soon, the world would find out. The morning after the interview, the media erupted. Every major news outlet covered the moment, each spinning it in their own way. Some framed Franklin's outburst as a passionate response. Others called it an unprofessional meltdown. But the internet had already made up its mind. Clips of the interview dominated social media. The uncut version, where Franklin lost his cool, had tens of millions of views. Overnight, it was clear, people weren't just talking about what happened. They were analyzing what it meant. By midday, Franklin released a statement on his show's official account. "Last night's interview with Karoline Leavitt was a spirited discussion. While I stand by my questioning, I regret that I let my frustration show. I believe in tough conversations, and I welcome opposing viewpoints. I appreciate Karoline for coming on and engaging in the debate. The wording was carefully chosen. He wasn't apologizing, but he also wasn't doubling down. He wanted to seem reasonable without fully admitting he had lost control. But Karoline knew better. She had seen it before, a PR-crafted response designed to smooth things over without addressing the real issue. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. The reaction to Franklin's statement was brutal. Translation? I got wrecked on live TV, and I don't want to talk about it. He didn't just let frustration show, he lost it because he couldn't handle someone pushing back. Just admit you were out of line, Graham. It's not that hard. Meanwhile, Karoline's platform exploded. Her followers doubled, then tripled. Podcasts and news outlets flooded her inbox, all wanting her to speak about what happened. But Karoline wasn't interested in victory laps. For her, this wasn't about one debate, one interview, or one viral moment. It was about something much bigger. In the days that followed, people kept debating what happened. Some tried to defend Franklin, saying he was just frustrated. Others said he had exposed himself as the exact thing he accused others of being, a biased figure who couldn't handle real discourse. But one thing was undeniable, people saw the truth for themselves. No carefully edited segment. No misleading headlines. Just the raw moment where someone who controlled the narrative lost control. And that was why it mattered. Because this wasn't just about Franklin. It was about how conversations in America were being shaped. About how media figures could shut down discussions instead of engaging in them. About how people were tired of being told what to think. Karoline knew she had struck a nerve. And that's what scared them the most. A week later, Franklin's show returned to its usual format. His team never mentioned the interview again. It was clear they were trying to move on. But the internet never forgets. And neither did the people who saw what happened that night. Karoline knew there would be more battles ahead. More moments where people in power would try to control the narrative. But she also knew something else. The more they tried to suppress real conversations, the more people would start paying attention. And once you see through the game, you never look at it the same way again. If you took something away from this story, don't just let it end here. Think critically. Question everything. And most importantly, never be afraid to speak up. Because the moment you stop speaking, they win. And we can't let that happen.